I was recently talking to a friend who was scrolling through a news feed, stopping on a headline about a series of routine naval exercises in a disputed strait. He shrugged and tossed his phone aside, saying, as long as they aren't actually shooting at each other, we're at peace. It's just posturing. To him, the world was a simple binary, a light switch that was either set to peace or war. But as I watched the footage of those destroyers cutting through the water, I realized he was missing the most terrifying part of the picture. He saw those ships as expensive props in a hollow theater.
Right, just for show.
Exactly. He didn't see that those vessels weren't just there. They were a specific sense in a very long, very calculated conversation. What struck me was how we've been conditioned to think of military force as a final resort, the end of diplomacy.
The absolute last thing that happens.
But in reality, the barrel of a gun is a tool of statecraft used with the precision of a scalpel, long before a formal declaration of war is ever signed. It's not a light switch, it's a sophisticated dimmer. A nation might turn up the intensity just a fraction of a decibel to see who flinches, or expand the scale of a border patrol just enough to signal that a map is being redrawn in real time.
And that dimmer analogy is, I think, the most important idea we'll talk about today.
When you look closely at the gray zone, the targeted drone strikes that punish without escalating, or the intentional airspace incursions designed to exhaust an enemy's nerves, you start to realize that peace is often just the lowest setting on a spectrum of violence.
It's not the absence of conflict, it's just the lowest intensity of conflict.
The logic of, it's okay to push as long as we don't break it, is a high-stakes gamble played every single day. This leads to a chilling question. If military action is a spectrum, how do we know when a warning has quietly shifted into a plan for total erasure?
And where is that line, that point of no return?
And at what point does a signal become a point of no return? To understand where the world is heading, we have to stop looking for the explosion and start measuring the heat.
That concept, measuring the heat rather than, waiting for the fire, is the fundamental premise of what we need to discuss today. Our mission here really is to dismantle that binary view of peace versus war.
It's too simple.
It's a comfortable illusion, absolutely. But as the sources we have gathered demonstrate, it is an illusion that obscures the reality of modern statecraft. We need to look at conflict not as an on-off switch, but as a spectrum of constant manipulation.
And to do that effectively, we have gone through a significant amount of material. This isn't just us reacting to the day's news cycle here. We're drawing from threads in, military history forums that debate the granular details of infrastructure resilience.
The really nerdy but crucial stuff.
Totally. And then academic papers focusing on NATO deterrence theory and the mechanics of the gray zone, and also some really heavy analysis on industrial warfare capabilities from institutions like RUSI and the National Security Journal.
It is a diverse stack, but what's really striking is the consensus across these disparate sources. It's pretty remarkable.
What's the thread that ties them all together?
Well, whether you are looking at the logistics of rail repair or the psychology of cyber warfare, the underlying mechanism is the same. Nations are constantly adjusting that dimmer switch you mentioned. They are manipulating the intensity and the scale of their actions to achieve strategic goals that previously might have required a full-scale invasion.
So they're turning the dimmer up just enough to get what they want: coercion, territory, influence, but keeping it low enough that the rest of the world doesn't feel compelled to jump in.
Exactly. It is the art of strategic manipulation. And to understand how this actually functions in the real world, you have to look at the machinery that allows a state to even touch that dimmer switch in the first place. We have to look at what sustains a conflict when the intensity begins to rise.
Okay, and I want to start that examination with a narrative that really grounded this concept for me. It moves us away from the abstract maps and into the reality of industrial warfare.
Let's do it.
I've been spending a lot of time lately looking into the mechanics of modern conflict, and I came across a story about a man named Merrick, living in a sprawling industrial city in Eastern Europe. And I want you to try to imagine a world where the horizon is perpetually gray, not from the weather, but from the smoke of 1,000 chimneys that haven't stopped breathing for 18 months.
Wow.
Merrick is a floor manager at a plant that used to manufacture agricultural components, but now it produces artillery shells. He doesn't see the front lines, but he feels the weight of attrition in the tremors of the floorboards.
He's living the war, just in a different way.
In a totally different way. I heard that Merrick hasn't seen his children in weeks because the quotas have tripled. He realizes that the victory promised on the news isn't a matter of a heroic charge, but a cold mathematical race of logistics.
It's an equation.
It's purely an equation. If his machines stop, a trench somewhere hundreds of miles away collapses. I saw a post online describing how he stares at the raw steel shipments arriving daily, realizing that in high-intensity warfare, the factory is the true battlefield. The infrastructure isn't just a target. It is the lungs of the state. I watched this story unfold, and I couldn't help but feel a chilling sense of reality. We often romanticize the soldier, but we forget the crushing burden placed on the civilian infrastructure that must outproduce the enemy's will to continue. It's a brutal logic where human endurance is measured in industrial output.
It really is.
It's uncomfortable to think of people as mere cogs in a machine of attrition. But from a strategic lens, Merrick's exhaustion is the price of a nation's survival in a world where the scale of violence is moved beyond mere skirmishes into a total test of civilizational capacity.
Merrick's reality is the perfect illustration of what military analysts refer to as high-intensity attrition warfare. It's a grim concept. For the last few decades, particularly in the West, we have been conditioned by movies and, these short conflicts to think of war as a matter of special forces, precision strikes, and rapid resolution. We view it as a sprint.
Get in, get out, mission accomplished.
Exactly. But the reality of peer-to-peer conflict, the kind we are seeing return to the global stage, is a marathon. It is decided by industrial output. It's decided by who has more guys like Merrick and whose factories can run longer.
So it seems to be a shift from prestige to production. Is that a fair way to put it?
That is the crucial distinction. That's a perfect way to put it. For a long time, militaries focused on prestige projects, the most advanced jet fighter, the high-tech tank that looks incredible in a parade, the stuff that gets the funding.
The shiny objects.
The shiny objects. But Merrick represents the return to production. It is boring, it is dirty, and it is entirely about logistics and quotas. As the analysis points out, if you cannot keep the depot stocked and the factories humming, it does not matter how brave or well-trained your soldiers are. The factory floor is where the war is won or lost.
This brings us to a very gritty, practical part of the research regarding infrastructure. If the factory is the heart, then the roads and rails are the veins. And we found some fascinating discussions on just how difficult it is to actually disrupt that flow. Like the common assumption is, if you want to stop the army, just bomb the road.
It is a classic misconception, and it's one you see in movies all the time. One of our sources used a very relatable analogy. If you are driving to work and there is a pothole or a road closure, do you cancel your day and go home?
No, you just pull up Google Maps and find another way.
No, you open a map app and route yourself to the nearest side street. Military logistics networks operate on the same principle. They have massive redundancy. They have built-in workarounds.
And the sources were saying that bombing a road is almost useless because engineers can fill a crater in a few hours. But regarding rail tracks, I was really surprised to learn just how resilient they are.
Rail is incredibly robust. Unbelievably robust. The Russians, for instance, have specialized railway troops, entire brigades, whose sole purpose is to repair tracks. It is just steel and wood.
It's not complex technology.
Not at all. If a section is blown up, they cut it out, drop in a prefabricated replacement, weld it, and the train is moving again very, very quickly. Hours, not days. So to really stop a train network, you can't just hit the tracks. You have to hit the choke points.
And that is where the physics of it gets difficult. Right. Yeah. We aren't talking about blowing up a random stretch of track in a field. We're talking about bridges and signaling systems.
Exactly. And dropping a bridge is what the military calls a non-trivial effort. Yeah. That's a bit of an understatement. Bridges are over-engineered structures designed to hold massive dynamic loads. They're built to withstand floods, earthquakes.
It's a lot of weight.
A tremendous amount of weight. So to take one out, you need precision bunker-busting bombs to shatter the abutments, the concrete anchors, or you need incredibly lucky, sustained heavy artillery. It's not a one-and-done kind of thing.
And even then, the sources pointed out that if there are 5 bridges in a region, destroying one is just an annoyance. It's an inconvenience.
It's a traffic jam. It's not a strategic victory. You have to drop 3 or 4 of them to create a genuine crisis, to actually sever the artery.
Right.
But the sources highlight an even greater vulnerability, one that's much more subtle, the brains of the railway, the signaling and switching systems.
Okay, so not the physical tracks, but the system that controls them.
Precisely. If you destroy the computerized switching center, the trains do not know where to go. They crash or have to stop completely. It creates chaos. You can replace a steel rail in an hour. You cannot replace a complex electronic signaling system in a war zone easily. It attacks the organization of the system rather than just the material.
That makes perfect sense. It is attacking the software rather than the hardware. However, there was one historical example in the notes regarding scorched earth that was particularly disturbing. The rail wolf.
The Schienenwolf, yes. It is a terrifying piece of engineering from World War II. It really shows you the level of intent required to completely destroy infrastructure.
What was it exactly?
It was a giant hook plow that the Germans dragged behind a locomotive as they retreated from the Eastern Front. It did not just break the track, it hooked under the wooden ties, ripped them right out of the ground, and as it moved forward, it twisted the steel rails into these unusable, mangled shapes.
So it's not something you can just repair. You have to rebuild it from scratch.
You have to relay the entire line. That is the level of effort required to truly deny infrastructure to an enemy. It isn't just about damage. It is about total erasure of the capacity to move. It's a message of ultimate finality.
It creates an image of total, calculated destruction. But let's zoom out from the history and look at the current geopolitical landscape. We are talking about industrial capacity and infrastructure.
Right.
How does this stack up right now? We have sources contrasting the Russian approach with the European approach.
This comparison is absolutely critical to understanding the current moment. Russia has made a distinct and very deliberate pivot towards industrial war. They have moved away from trying to manufacture the most exquisite, perfect, high-tech hardware.
The prestige projects we talked about.
The prestige projects. Instead, they are focusing on good enough precision and massive volume. It's a different philosophy of warfare.
Quantity, having a quality all its own.
Precisely that old saying. They are prioritizing software updates for old missiles rather than building entirely new airframes. They are focusing on glide bombs, which are essentially cheap, dumb bombs with simple guidance kits attached that they can produce in the thousands.
So it's about efficiency and mass.
It is a managerial turn. It is not about shock and awe in the way the West has conceived of it. It is about having enough math on your side to grind the enemy down over time. It's about attrition.
And the sources describe Russia not necessarily as a global superpower in the old sense, but as a regional power with global strike tools. What does that distinction mean?
That is a very important distinction. It means they might not be projecting power in Africa or South America in the same way the U.S. does, but they are building a military designed to make their immediate neighbors, and by extension Europe, blink. They can coerce their neighbors through sheer mass and endurance. They are built for the long, grinding fight.
Now, compare that to Europe. Our sources were, well, they were quite critical of the current state of European industrial capacity.
It is a struggle. There's no other way to put it. Europe has significant financial resources, obviously, but the defense market is incredibly fragmented. You have different countries competing to build different tanks and different artillery systems.
Everyone wants their own project.
Everyone wants their own domestic jobs program, which is what these projects often become. There is no centralized plan. And then on top of that, you have the regulatory burden.
This was the part that was really surprising to me. The idea that safety regulations are hindering defense production.
It sounds mundane, doesn't it? But it has enormous strategic consequences. In Russia, factories are running 247, often bypassing safety and environmental regulations to meet quotas. In Europe, production is still bound by strict peacetime regulations. Things like worker safety, environmental impact statements, all important, but they slow everything down.
So one side is on a total war footing, and the other is still operating by peacetime rules.
That's a good way to summarize it. One is sprinting, the other is jogging and filling out paperwork.
So ultimately, when you boil it all down, it is a math problem.
Containment is absolutely a math problem. If your enemy produces X number of shells per month and you and your allies produce Y and X is significantly larger than Y, deterrence fails. It just does. You cannot deter a nation that knows it can outproduce you and outlast you in a long war. The numbers don't lie.
So the takeaway for this first section is really that in high-intensity conflict, the boring stuff, the logistics, the rail repair, the factory quotas, is the deadliest weapon. It is not about the hero. It is about the machine.
The machine determines who survives and whose machine is bigger and runs more efficiently.
We have looked at the machine. Now I want to shift gears and look at the fog, because not every conflict involves artillery shells flattening cities. Sometimes the violence is much quieter, much more ambiguous. To understand this, we need to look at a different kind of front line.
The gray zone.
Exactly. There's another perspective I've been researching, which takes us to the shimmering, contested waters of the South China Sea. I want you to try to imagine a fisherman named Elias. He doesn't carry a rifle, but his boat is a piece on a global chessboard.
He's a pawn, but a very important one.
A very important one. I read an account of how Elias finds himself constantly flanked by maritime militia, vessels that aren't quite Navy but aren't quite civilian. This is the gray zone in its most human form. For Elias, strategic deterrence isn't a headline. It's the daily choice to keep casting his nets despite the looming shadow of a giant white hull that refuses to identify itself.
The psychological pressure must be immense.
It has to be. He represents a form of civilizational resilience, the quiet, stubborn refusal to yield space, even when the pressure is subtle and constant. I heard that these fishermen have become the eyes and ears of their state, turning their traditional livelihood into a tool of non-kinetic signaling.
They're a living, breathing sensor network.
They live in the low-intensity rung of the ladder, where the goal isn't to sink ships, but to exhaust the opponent's patience and rewrite the status quo through sheer presence. Reading about Elias makes me reflect on the multipolar world we often discuss so abstractly. While we talk about gray zone tactics, for people like Elias, it's just a life of permanent tension.
It's just Tuesday.
It's just Tuesday. It's a sophisticated, almost cruel form of statecraft that uses ordinary people as a buffer. From a political standpoint, one might argue this is a necessary shield against outright war, a way to exert pressure without crossing the threshold of total conflict. However, seeing it through his eyes, you realize that strategic deterrence is built on the nerves of those who have no choice but to stay in the water. It's a delicate balance of power that demands a high price from the individual for the sake of the collective's resilience.
Elias is living right in the center of what we call the gray zone, and it's so important to understand this concept. This is the space between peace and war, where ambiguity is weaponized. And what is fascinating and, frankly, tragic is that Elias himself has become a tool of statecraft.
It's the cabbage strategy, right? I recall reading that term in the sources regarding China's approach in the South China Sea.
Yes, the cabbage strategy. It is a vivid and very accurate metaphor. You wrap a contested area in layer after layer of influence, like the leaves of a cabbage.
So what are the layers?
First, you send in the fishing boats. The maritime militia, like the ones harassing Elias, hundreds of them. They just show up and start fishing, claiming historical rights. They're the outermost, softest layer. Then, behind them, you send in the Coast Guard vessels for law enforcement. They have white hulls, not gray ones, which signals police action, not military action.
And only behind that do you have the Navy.
And only behind that, way over the horizon, do you have the gray-hulled Navy destroyers. So it is like peeling an onion or a cabbage. You have to get through all these civilian and quasi-civilian layers before you even see a military ship.
And what's the strategic genius of that, or the strategic problem it creates for the other side?
It creates a terrible dilemma for the defender. If a foreign Navy ship comes into your waters, you know what to do. You send your AV. It's a clear military problem. But if it is just a fishing boat swarming your waters, or 100 of them, if you shoot at them, you look like a monster. You are the aggressor, firing on unarmed civilians.
So it's weaponizing the definition of civilian. And the sources called this salami slicing as well. How did that fit in?
Salami slicing is the tactical result of the cabbage strategy. You use these ambiguous forces to take one thin slice of territory or influence today. You claim a reef. You build a small structure on it. It is so small that no one wants to go to war over it.
It's not worth it.
It's not worth starting World War III over some rocks. Then tomorrow you take another slice, you add an airstrip, and another slice, you add a radar. Before the opponent realizes it, you have the whole salami. You have changed the status quo, you have a military base, without ever firing a shot in anger.
And it's not just boats. They use lawfare.
Lawfare is a key component. It's using the law or the appearance of law enforcement as a weapon. So instead of firing military missiles, the Coast Guard uses high-pressure water cannons to disperse vessels. They ram boats and claim it was a maritime trafficking accident. It keeps the conflict below the threshold of a formal military response.
It's all about maintaining that ambiguity. Now, China's not the only one playing in this gray zone. Our sources went deep into Russia's approach as well, specifically this concept of active measures.
Aktivnie meropryatия, yes. It is an old Soviet concept that has been updated for the digital age. It's much more sophisticated than what people think. In the West, we often just call it disinformation, but it is so much more than that. It is not just about lying.
Right. The sources said the goal isn't just to tell a lie, but to mix propaganda with pre-existing narratives, to smear individuals and create internal distrust.
Precisely. You don't invent a fire. You find a crack in a society. Racial tensions, political polarization, economic anxiety, and you find embers that are already smoldering, and you pour gasoline on them. You insert a wedge.
How does that work in practice?
You fund contradictory groups. You might give money to a far-right group and a far-lefty group in the same country. You stroke the tensions. The goal is to make the society fight itself so it cannot present a united front to fight you.
And then there is the cyber domain. This seems like the ultimate gray zone tool because of the attribution problem.
Attribution is the holy grail of the gray zone. It is the core of it. If a missile hits a building, you can usually tell where it came from based on the debris. But if a banking system goes down or air traffic control goes dark, it takes time, sometimes weeks or months, to prove who did it. And by then, the news cycle has moved on.
We saw this with GPS jamming in the Baltics, right? The sources mentioned that.
A perfect example. It disrupts civilian flights, it endangers shipping, but is it an act of war? Who do you blame? How do you prove it? It's fuzzy.
And that fuzziness is the point. And of course, we have to mention the little green men from 2014 in Crimea. That seems like the textbook case study.
The ultimate example. You have soldiers, heavily armed, professional, taking over airports and government buildings, but they have no insignia on their uniforms. Everyone knew they were Russian, but because they didn't wear the flag, it gave Russia plausible deniability. It froze the international response just long enough for them to secure the territory.
This brings us to a really important concept from the academic papers we looked at, the Stability-Instability Paradox. It sounds complicated, but we need to unpack it because it explains the logic behind all of this.
It is actually quite intuitive once you get it. The paradox is this. We have nuclear weapons. That creates stability at the high end of the conflict spectrum because total war is suicidal. Nobody wants World War III because it ends the world.
Okay, so the ultimate weapons create ultimate stability.
At the very top, yes. But because everyone knows total war is off the table, it makes the lower levels of conflict unsafe or unstable.
So just to make sure I have this right, because we can't have a big war, nations feel safe having lots of little wars. Or not even wars, but these gray zone conflicts.
Exactly. Nations feel safe to push, to engage in gray zone violence, to use maritime militias and cyber attacks, because they're betting that the other side won't escalate to nuclear war over a fishing boat or a hacked server. It's a safe space for aggression.
The logic is, it's okay to push, as long as we don't break it.
And that leads directly to the boiling frog analogy, which is just a terrifying way to think about it. If you throw a frog in boiling water, it jumps out. That is a sudden invasion. Article 5 is triggered, everyone reacts.
But if you put it in lukewarm water and turn up the heat slowly,
it boils to death without ever realizing it needs to escape. That is the danger of the gray zone. These tactics slowly raise the heat, the instability, without ever triggering a collective response, like NATO's Article 5. By the time you realize you are at war, you might have already lost.
That is terrifying. It really changes how you look at the news. You stop seeing random events and start seeing a temperature check.
We have to stop looking for the explosion and start measuring the heat.
Okay, so we have seen the machine and we have navigated the fog. Now I want to look at the game itself, because despite all this ambiguity, there are rules, or at least patterns, to how this escalation works. And to understand the high stakes of this game, we need to step into the shoes of someone who sees the board from the top down.
The strategic level?
Exactly. Finally, I've been thinking about the high-level side of things, the world that exists beyond procedural diplomacy. I came across an anecdote about a seasoned diplomat named Elena, stationed in a neutral European capital during a period of escalating tension. Imagine her sitting in a sterile, gold-leafed room, realizing that the formal communiques she's been exchanging are essentially meaningless, just paper. I heard that during a private late-night meeting, her counterpart from an opposing power didn't offer a proposal. Instead, he simply showed her a map of his country's latest military mobilization.
Not a word, just the map.
Just the map. It was a moment of symbolic signaling that bypassed every bureaucratic channel. The scale of the movement on that map told her more about their intent to revive or destroy than 1,000 pages of treaty text ever could. She realized then that when states move toward the higher rungs of the spectrum, the procedure of diplomacy falls away, leaving only the raw communication of force and will.
It's the mask coming off.
It really is. And it's fascinating and honestly a bit terrifying to realize how thin the veneer of international protocol actually is. I looked at this story and felt that Elena's realization is one we are all starting to share. That in a world of high-stakes statecraft, the rules are often just a mask for the underlying reality of power.
Absolutely.
While some might see this as a breakdown of order, from a realist perspective, it's a necessary evolution, a move toward a more honest form of communication between powers where actions, not words, define the boundaries of the world. It's a cold way to view human interaction, but in the realm of existential warfare, it's the only language that is truly understood.
Elena's story is chilling because it strips away the niceties. It reveals what we call the spectrum of escalation, or sometimes the latter. Diplomacy isn't just words. Moving troops is a sentence in a conversation. Showing that map was an entire paragraph.
Let's break down this ladder. Our sources laid out 5 specific rungs. I want to walk through them so we can visualize this, because it helps make sense of how things can spiral.
Sure, it's a useful framework. The first rung, the lowest, is symbolic signaling. This is what Elena experienced. It is non-kinetic. Nobody is shooting yet. It involves verbal warnings, drawing red lines in speeches, and crucially, military exercises.
So when you see on the news, Country X begins massive war games, that's rung 1.
That's rung 1. When a country holds a massive naval drill right off your coast, they are rehearsing for war. They are showing you, we can do this, this is what it would look like. It's a demonstration of capability and intent.
It is flexing. It is the bodybuilder posing before the fight. Then we move to rung 2.
Rung 2 is low-intensity kinetic, or the gray zone in action. We talked about this with Elias. This is where you actually break things or hurt people, but you do it in a way that is deniable or kept limited.
Give me some examples.
Border friction. A patrol accidentally crosses the border. Incursions into air defense identification zones like flying bombers near Taiwan, forcing them to scramble jets. It wears down their readiness and their budget. Or targeted strikes that are meant to punish, not destroy. A strike on a weapons depot, for example.
Okay. Rung 3. This feels like where things get serious.
Limited war. This is where things get kinetic and acknowledged. The masks are off. But it has defined boundaries, either geographically or in terms of objectives. The goal isn't to wipe the other country off the map. It is to change their behavior.
So give us this province or stop doing this thing, and once you do, the war is over.
Exactly. The goals are limited, and therefore the war is, in theory, limited.
Rung 4 seems like the one we are most familiar with from history books.
Total war. This is the Iraq model from 2003 or World War II. The goal is regime change. You are mobilizing your entire national resource base, your economy, your industry, your population to dismantle the enemy's government. You aren't just taking a slice of salami, you are taking the whole kitchen.
And finally, the dark pole of the spectrum. Rung 5.
Existential warfare. State extinction or genocide. This is where the goal is total erasure. The physical annexation where the country ceases to exist on a map, or the physical elimination of a people. It is the absolute darkest limit of human violence.
Wow. Seeing it laid out like that, rung by rung, it really makes you realize how dangerous it is to misinterpret a signal. If you think someone is on rung 1, just posturing, but they are actually prepping for rung 4.
That is how catastrophic wars start. Miscalculation. One side thinks it's sending a signal, the other side sees it as a prelude to invasion.
Now, in this high-stakes game, we have to talk about NATO. NATO is the biggest player on one side of this board, but our sources highlighted a massive challenge for NATO, and the word they used was interoperability.
It sounds like a dry, technical buzzword, but it is the Achilles heel of any alliance, and it's a huge problem. How do 32 different nations, with 32 different militaries and political systems, respond to a threat, especially a fast-moving gray zone threat?
And it isn't just about plugging a French radio into an American tank, right? It's deeper than that.
That's technical interoperability, and that is hard enough. You've got countries in Eastern Europe trying to integrate legacy Soviet gear with brand new American F-35s. But the real, almost intractable challenge is human interoperability.
What does that mean?
It means you have 28 different languages. You have profound cultural misalignment. A commander from one country might interpret a warning very differently than a commander from another. What one culture sees as a prudent defensive measure, another might see as an aggressive escalation.
And then there is the money. We always hear about the 2% spending rule. Every country has to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. But the analysis we read suggests that is a deeply flawed metric.
The sources call it the 2% fallacy. It's politically useful because it's a simple number, but it's strategically misleading. It measures input, how much cash you are throwing at the problem, not output, which is actual capability.
So you could be spending the money badly.
You can spend 2% of your GDP on lavish pensions for retired generals and gold-plated barracks, and you won't be any safer. You are just spending money, not building combat power. It's a measure of effort, not effectiveness.
You're just checking a box, not actually building a deterrent.
Precisely. The obsession with the number distracts from the actual capabilities needed to fight in the gray zone or an industrial war. Things like shell production, logistics, and secure communications.
So how do we fix this? Or how does NATO adapt? The sources mention moving from deterrence by denial to something called gray deterrence. What does that look like?
Deterrence by denial is the old model. It's building a wall. You can't come in. If you cross this line, we will fight you. It's very clear, very binary. Gray deterrence is smarter, more suited for this new environment. It is using information operations to deny, discredit, and delegitimize the adversary's actions in the gray zone.
So it's fighting fire with fire in the information space. Before they can claim plausible deniability, you're already out there showing everyone what they're doing.
Exactly. You expose the little green men before they even leave their barracks. And it is about bottom-up intelligence. This was a fascinating point in the research. Local police often see the signs of hybrid warfare before the military or national intelligence agencies do. They see the uptick in organized crime that might be funding covert operations. Or they see weird patterns in local corruption that hint at foreign interference. They see the small, strange things that don't make sense.
So the local cop on the beat might be the first line of defense against a gray zone invasion.
Precisely. If we can build systems that connect those dots from the bottom up, we can spot the pattern before it becomes a full-blown military crisis. We can catch the frog when the water is still just lukewarm.
That is incredible. We've covered so much ground today. Let's try to synthesize this for a moment. We started on the factory floor with Merrick, watching the steel turn into shells, realizing that industrial stamina is the foundation of modern war.
Then we moved to the waters with Elias, seeing how the gray zone uses ambiguity and civilians to slice the salami and change the map without ever triggering a conventional war.
And we ended in the diplomat's office with Elena, looking at the spectrum of escalation and realizing that a map of mobilization is a louder sentence than any speech.
And the common thread here, the thing that ties it all together, is that dimmer switch. The world is rarely at peace or war. It is constantly fluctuating on the spectrum of intensity and scale.
So why does this matter to you, listening to this?
Yeah.
It matters because it changes how you read the world. When you see a routine exercise, you know it is a message. When you hear about infrastructure projects in contested areas, you know they are potential weapons. You can see through the fog of gray zone headlines.
It moves you away from the anxiety of asking, is World War III starting? Which is a binary light switch question. It moves you to a more analytical view. How much heat was just added to the system? And who turned the dial?
And I want to leave you with one final thought. We've spent an hour talking about how nations are playing this high-stakes game of signaling and industrial endurance. But there is a variable we haven't touched on. In a world where peace is just the lowest setting on a spectrum of violence, and where the lines between a civilian fisherman and a naval combatant are erased, the definition of innocent bystander is disappearing too. If the factory floor and the fishing boat are now the front lines, then the next time the dimmer switch is turned up, it might not be the soldiers who feel the heat first. It might be us.